December the 7th, 1941, a date that will forever live in American memory. World War II had been in full swing for its second year, with no end in sight. To the people in the United States, the war seemed distant, far off, as they focused on building back up from a crippling depression. That is, until the war came to them. At 7:53 a.m. on December the 7th, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise air attack on the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor. Within 90 minutes, the attack was over, with 2,400 Americans killed and another 1,200 wounded. The U.S. was a sleeping industrial machine, and with all machines, they needed that first bit of fuel to come to life, and Pearl Harbor was that fuel. The following day, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave his famous infamy speech to Congress, and 1 hour later, the United States officially declared war against the Empire of Japan, forcing to World War II and the years of bloodshed that it would entail. But the question must be asked then, what if this attack never happened? What if the Japanese never bombed Pearl Harbor, and the catalyst for American entry into the war simply wasn't there? How different would events play out in this alternate timeline? And to answer that, we need some history. By 1930 in Japan, the civilian government had largely lost its control over the military, who now acted with heavy degrees of autonomy. This loss of control had been ongoing ever since the 1880s, with the creation of the Army and Naval Commanding Staffs. These staffs were equal in power to the Minister of War and answered directly to the Emperor rather than having to go through the civilian government. The Army and Navy also had decisive say on the formation of any civilian government, since the law required that the posts of Army Minister and Navy Minister be filled by active duty officers, and since the law also required that a Prime Minister resign if he could not fill all of his cabinet posts, both the Army and Navy had final say on the formation of a cabinet and could bring down the cabinet at any time by withdrawing their minister and refusing to nominate a successor. While this only happened once, the threat always loomed high when the military made any demands on the civilian leadership. Throughout the 30s, the military attempted 3 coups against the civilian government, which all failed, while their actions in China grew heavy support from the public. After another failed coup in 1936, the Japanese civil government officially stepped down, hoping to reduce the unrest that was building. While this didn't allow a military dictatorship, the new military government heavily increased spending and set Japan on a war footing, with the goal of expanding Japanese influence to the Pacific and Asia, invading China in what would be known as the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. The issue was that Japan lacked much in the way of war resources, importing over 80% of all of their oil, as well as large amounts of metal, rubber, tin, etc. The atrocities in China and the further military buildup made the Western Pacific powers worried, as Japan time and again refused to listen to diplomatic measures and treaties that had been established prior. The trouble brewing in Europe only added to this fear. The Italians had left the Stresa front and were looking to Germany for an ally. Germany itself had reoccupied the Rhineland, much to the dismay of the French, and were now pressing for claims against Austria. The last thing that the British, French, and Dutch wanted was to have to worry about their major colonies and their homeland at the same time. The homeland blew up first. Within a year of the outbreak of World War II, France had been occupied, and most of Europe was under Axis control. Most of the French colonies were administered out of a German puppet state, Vichy French. The Japanese, seeing this, couldn't pass up the chance to gain more influence. Japan issued ultimatums to the French in Indochina, fully invading the colony on September the 22nd, occupying the whole of it within 4 days. This proved too much for the Pacific powers to ignore. Negotiations between the Japanese and the United States lasted the rest of the year, but nothing came of it. In July of 1941, the United States imposed an oil and steel embargo against the Japanese, with the addition of freezing Japanese assets in the States. The home islands lacked the war material that Japan needed to continue their war against China, so they were left with two choices: either stop their operations in China and hope that trade can be restored, or try to take the resources in the South by force. They chose the latter. The Japanese invaded British-held Malaysia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch-held East Indies. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to give Japan enough time to conquer, then fortify, the islands against the eventual and guaranteed American attack. But in this reality, what if the attack on Pearl Harbor never happened? This isn't that hard to accomplish in all actuality. The decision to raid Pearl Harbor was something that almost didn't happen in the first place. The Navy General Staff proved reluctant to go along with the raid, and Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Navy, was eventually driven to threaten to resign to get his way. So either Yamamoto couldn't get his way, or Emperor Hirohito, who had limited control over his military, finally asserted some command and refuses the raid to happen. If the raid on Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, there is still one major obstacle in Japan's strike south: the Philippines. The Philippines had been under American control since the Spanish-American War of 1898. Hint, hint, click my video on that subject here. And while not defended as it could be, the island had a substantial American presence that would be difficult to ignore. Ignoring the islands would mean that the shipping lanes between the oil-rich lands in the south and the home islands would be threatened, and a gaping hole would exist in Japan's island defense strategy. But for this scenario, let's say that the Japanese command is willing to run the risk, and hope that the Americans won't join the war until the invasions in the south are completed. While it may seem like a logical idea, this wouldn't stop the United States from entering the war. It merely delays the inevitable. An environment where Japan strikes south but does not attack Pearl Harbor or the Philippines is an environment where a major incident will happen sooner or later. The Japanese will have their lines of communication and vital shipping lanes under constant monitoring by increasingly aggressive and intrusive American sea and air patrols. American skippers will be given very liberal rules of engagement and were instructed in late 1941 that any heavy air or naval convoy was to be considered hostile. They will be told to use their best judgment when it comes to acting in self-defense, and if that means shooting first, the chain of command up to the president will back you up. There will be Japanese commanders down at the unit level who think that not attacking the Americans and just leaving them alone was a bad idea, and these same commanders will have to face American patrols from the Philippines on a regular basis. Somebody is going to shoot. But the United States is building up their forces in the Pacific, and this was known to the Japanese command. Ships that had started construction in 1940 would be completed, and the Japanese would face a full American Navy that further outnumbered them. But that buildup will take time. In the interim, the lack of an invasion of the Philippines would allow the use of the land and naval forces to be allocated to other fronts, quickening operations in Indonesia and Malaya, and dealing an even heavier blow to the British in Burma. Any advances into India wouldn't go much further than in our timeline, as the ability to supply an army through the largely untamed forests of Burma was extremely difficult, even with the eventual establishment of a railway and civil roads. The focus of the Americans was Europe pre-war, and they heavily underestimated Japanese naval and land power. But without the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the US would still have a large European focus, while also building up defenses in the Pacific. Whichever side of the world triggers the American response is up in the air, but that trigger will be pulled. A Japanese plan, referred to as Kentai Kenzen, was the naval plan in the advent of a war against the United States. The plan was first constructed during the war with Russia in 1904, with heavy focus being on a major battleship engagement with the naval war. The plan was altered throughout the decades as German islands in the Pacific were added to the Japanese Empire, and land-based aircraft became viable. The use of fast submarines, land-based aircraft, and first-class battleships would render any fleet in motion heavily damaged, if not outright destroyed. In practice, however, this plan didn't work very well. But if the American fleet is ordered to protect the Philippines against the inevitable invasion, which the Navy didn't want to, they would fall right into the trap. Many have suggested that the battle will be similar to Jutland, with both navies heavily damaged but nothing decisive. However, for Japan, nearly every World War II scenario is bleak for them: outmanned, outgunned, outsupplied, and outproduced by America. For them, just as any other nation, when playing the game of war, the only way to win is to not play at all.